Hey everyone, Dave here. Well, the other day marked the release of Back to the Future, the game, Episode 2, Get Tannen. The release just sort of sneaked up on everyone, and as you can see, it put me in a festive Back to the Future mood. I was actually wearing this shirt coming out of the gym today, and the manager told me he was an extra in Part 3, so that's pretty cool. About the game. I'm going to start by talking about the gameplay, which once again is short and easy, but I think it's a step in the right direction. It was a little bit longer than part one of the game was, at least when I played through it, and there were more puzzles that had potential. The solutions were still really obvious. There's a part where you have to hide in a crate to get taken into the speakeasy, and there are a couple of crates, only one of them you can hide in, but it's the first one you see, so it's not really like you have to deduce anything. You just click on the first thing you see. But there are some other puzzles that were interesting and that actually required a tiny bit of thinking. The gameplay still has many flaws. There were several parts that probably should have been playable that were in cutscenes. Some of the action sequences probably could have made for playable puzzles. And there were probably a few parts that should have been cutscenes that were playable. There were also a handful of glitches in the game. The game keeps track of what name you gave as Marty in your last saved game from episode 1. And it mostly worked, but there was one case where I was called by the wrong name, and I've heard other people have had even more trouble in that arena. There were a number of glitches in the parts where, without spoiling too much, there's a sequence where young Emmett is on the roof of a building trying to retrieve something, and there are a couple of ways you can interact with him or things around him where it'll go back to the default response from him from before he was on the roof. So all of a sudden he'll just teleport down to the town square and then he'll teleport back up, which is distracting to say the least. So the gameplay has flaws, but I don't follow Telltale for the gameplay as much as I do for the story and the characters and the humor, which is the same reason I love Back to the Future, is the story, characters, and humor. So how does the story hold up? I have a few more issues with it than I did with Episode 1 story. It's probably partly because Episode 1, it was still novel and exciting. It was the first return to Back to the Future, and it was the first time seeing Marty and Doc again, so there was all that excitement. And now with Episode 2, now that initial thrill is gone, I have a few more problems with it. Not a whole bunch, but a few. The story, it's basically Back to the Future Part 2. It starts with a minor problem that's solved involving one of Marty's family members. Then they return to present-day Hill Valley, and everything seems normal, but then they find that it's overrun by Tannen's influence, and then they have to go back and fix whatever went wrong. And it's Back to the Future Part 2. They even have some of the classic, avoid your other self, that made the second movie so much fun. Except it's not so much fun when they do it in the game. That was actually the most boring part of the gameplay for me. There are also... I had a little bit of issue with how some of the things in Part 1 of the game didn't have nearly as strong of consequences as I would have expected. They still had consequences, but they weren't as far-reaching. After you break young Emmett's heart in the first one, but he still helps you anyway, because you inspired him to take a stand for himself, so that effect does carry in. Emmett is more confident than he was in Part 1, but he also just, is very casual when he sees you again after you go back to 1931. It's a few months after you were there in Episode 1, and so he's like, I haven't seen you in a few months, but I'm barely even going to look at you. I'm just going to say, hi, Harry Callahan, or whatever name you chose. Yeah, I've been watching after your dog for you for the past several months, even though you never asked me to do that. And why did they leave Einstein behind in 1931 when they thought that everything was okay? I don't know. I don't get it. It seemed a little out of character. But there are a lot of things I like, though. I liked the further exploration of Kid Tannen's gang, and I liked the prospect of him still being in control in 1985 or 1986, even though that was never quite fully explored as much as it could be. This was another thing that slightly bugged me. For the second time in a row, we hear Lorraine's voice but don't see her. And in the preview for episode 3 at the end of the game, we do see Lorraine, so we know that they have a Lorraine model, but I guess they just didn't have it ready for episodes 1 and 2. And it's just very odd considering the movies focus so much on Leah Thompson characters, but of course for obvious reasons didn't have Crispin Glover characters so much after part 1. Whereas the game is focusing much more on George and his father, they're both the Crispin Glover lookalikes, and the Leah Thompson character just sort of gets shoved aside. It's a little strange, but I mean, I like that they're exploring more of the George side of the family because George is one of my favorite characters in the series, so I really think his family history warrants exploration. And again, I liked things about it. I liked the speakeasy. I thought that there was some fun stuff there. I like that we see Jennifer's grandfather. And again, I feel like more could be explored there, and maybe more will in the upcoming parts. But it's good to see the ancestors of some of the other characters who don't get quite as much play in the movies. Now, the cliffhanger to episode 3, even though I sort of could tell what the cliffhanger was going to be, I still thought it was done well. It was presented in a way that pretty effectively built up suspense. I'm very curious about the direction episode 3 is going to go. I'm worried a little bit that it's going to be another rehash of, alternate 1985, of Tannen-controlled 1985, except, obviously with a different character in control. But I'm curious about it in terms of, I'm just going to spoil this for you now. In episode 3, it's clear that Doc is not helping Marty. And it'll be really interesting to see Marty come into his own without having Doc looking over his shoulder. If they flesh this idea out to its full potential, this could be really interesting character growth for Marty McFly. Finally, yes, they do the Tannen manure joke again, and it felt really forced this time. Like, I was happy to see that in episode 1 of the game, but in episode 2, it's just suddenly the manure truck's there. I could buy that in episode 1, but in episode 2, I'm like, okay, you're really milking the manure gag. But one running gag they used that they put a twist on that I liked is they actually had Kid Tannen do a "what the hell is that?" to distract somebody. And it was interesting to see a Tannen pull that on somebody else. So yeah, I enjoyed it, not quite as much as episode 1, even though I think the gameplay itself was better. I think the gameplay is slowly growing. It probably won't develop fast enough to get to a point where hardcore adventure gamers are going to be happy with it. But considering that I've seen a lot of people struggle with the really, really easy puzzles in episode 1, apparently Telltale knew what they were doing, reaching out to non-gaming Back to the Future fans, because I thought episode 1 was probably the easiest adventure game I've ever played, but I still see people struggling with it who aren't as used to the adventure game genre. So clearly Telltale knew exactly what demographic they were going after. And again, I follow Telltale games and Back to the Future for the story, characters, and humor, and I've been mostly enjoying the story, characters, and humor, even though I had a few issues with the latest part, but I'm still really looking forward to see where they go. I would like some more complex gameplay. I would like some more interesting puzzles, and puzzles where they don't make the solution so blaringly obvious. And I think the puzzles are slowly getting better. Not fast enough for everyone to be happy, but I'm still enjoying the game. So I look forward to episode 3, and I really want to see where the story goes. In other adventure games that are great with atmosphere but light on puzzles news, the 3rd episode of The Silver Lining, the King's Quest fan game, just came out, so I will be installing and playing that, and I'll probably let you know what I thought. Until then, this is Dave, signing off.